Bill Gates, one of the wealthiest men on Earth, spent the better part of a decade quietly becoming the single largest private owner of farmland in the United States. Nearly 270,000 acres spread across 19 states, growing onions, carrots, and the potatoes that eventually become McDonald's French fries. He's hardly alone. Across old money families for centuries, a specific, remarkably consistent shopping list keeps reappearing, generation after generation, regardless of what the stock market is doing: land, art, fine timepieces, and rare bottles that will outlive everyone who buys them. Today we're examining exactly what's on that list, why old money keeps buying the same handful of asset categories century after century, and what the actual data says about why these specific things, not stocks, not bonds, not the latest hot investment trend, remain permanent fixtures on the wealthiest shopping lists on Earth. If you want the real architecture behind generational wealth, including exactly what it's spent on, decade after decade, subscribe now. This channel breaks it all down, every week. 1. Land, the asset that never stops being made smaller. Let's start with the oldest asset on this entire list, one we've touched on in earlier videos on this channel, but that deserves its own detailed treatment here: farmland. Bill Gates's farmland holdings are, by a wide margin, the most publicly documented modern example of this instinct in action. According to the Land Report, Gates's holdings, accumulated primarily through his personal investment vehicle, Cascade Investment, mostly between 2017 and 2018, total somewhere in the range of 250,000 to 275,000 acres across at least 17 to 19 states, making him, at least for a period, the single largest private farmland owner in the country. Some individual transactions were enormous on their own. Roughly $690 million for a parcel known as 100 Circles in eastern Washington, and $113 million for 20,000 acres across 19 counties in Nebraska. When directly asked about it during a Reddit Ask Me Anything session, Gates responded plainly, "I own less than 1/4,000th of the farmland in the U.S. I have invested in these farms to make them more productive and create more jobs. There isn't some grand scheme involved. In fact, all these decisions are made by a professional investment team." Gates is far from unique among the ultra-wealthy in this specific appetite. Thomas Peterffy, the billionaire founder of Interactive Brokers, has separately accumulated an estimated 581,000 acres of his own, even more than Gates. American Farmland Trust CEO John Piatti summarized the underlying appeal succinctly. Farmland is an asset with increasing value, precisely because it has great intrinsic value, and beyond that, it is a limited resource. That last phrase, a limited resource, is really the entire investment thesis in 3 words, and it connects directly to the historical pattern covered in an earlier video on this channel about primogeniture and entailed estates. Land is one of the very few assets on Earth that genuinely cannot be manufactured to meet rising demand. A company can issue more shares. A central bank can print more currency. Nobody can create more farmland. According to U.S. Department of Agriculture estimates, total American farmland acreage has actually been shrinking by roughly 2 million acres a year, lost to development, while global population and food demand continue climbing. A structural mismatch between a fixed or declining supply and steadily rising demand that has underpinned land ownership as a store of value across every stable society in recorded history. There's also a quieter, less publicized structural detail that makes farmland especially attractive to old money specifically, as opposed to a typical retail investor. Roughly 30 to 39% of all U.S. farmland, according to USDA data, is owned by landlords who don't personally farm it at all, instead leasing it out to working farmers for a modest but remarkably stable annual cash return, often cited in the range of 2 to 5%. This is farmland functioning almost exactly like the family bank concept covered in an earlier video, a productive asset generating a steady, boring income stream held for decades, passed down largely intact, while the actual day-to-day operational risk is carried by someone else entirely. 2. Art, the asset that lives in a vault. It was never meant to leave. If farmland is old money's oldest asset, fine art is arguably its most quietly sophisticated, and the mechanics behind how it's actually held reveal a great deal about the broader old money playbook covered across this channel. The scale of the modern art market is genuinely enormous. Global art sales exceeded $65 billion in 2023 alone, and separate industry analysis estimated that high net worth individuals had allocated roughly $1.62 trillion to art and collectibles as of 2016, with projections suggesting that figure could climb to $2.7 trillion by 2026. But the far more interesting detail isn't how much art is bought. It's where it actually ends up living once it's bought. A remarkable share of the world's most valuable paintings never hang in anyone's home at all. They sit inside specialized high-security warehouses called freeports, the largest and most famous being the Geneva Freeport, a sprawling 150,000 square meter facility estimated to hold as much as 1.2 million individual works of art and other valuables, with a reported insurance value approaching $100 billion. One art law specialist has described these facilities memorably as the Swiss bank accounts of the art world, highly secure, discreet, and offering unparalleled services to art collectors. The reason art specifically gravitates toward this kind of storage comes down to a legal quirk shared by very few other assets. Because the artwork is technically classified as being in transit or in bonded storage rather than having formally entered any specific country's commercial market, it can avoid import duties, sales tax, and, in many jurisdictions, capital gains tax that would otherwise apply the moment the piece is sold or physically brought into a home. A painting can change ownership entirely, sold from one collector to another, without ever leaving the vault and without triggering many of the tax events that a typical sale would create elsewhere. Similar facilities have since opened in Luxembourg, Singapore, and even a smaller freeport in Delaware, giving American collectors a comparable option without needing to ship valuable works overseas at all. This connects directly to an important, very current detail from our earlier video on how old money legally reduces its tax burden. The estate tax exemption increase under the 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill Act has had a specific documented ripple effect on the art market itself. Industry analysis of the 2026 art market notes that with the federal estate tax exemption now raised to roughly $15 million per individual, heirs of major collectors are no longer under the same immediate pressure to sell inherited masterpieces simply to cover a tax bill, meaning a meaningful share of what the industry calls estate or death inventory, paintings that would previously have been forced onto the market to settle a tax obligation, is now staying locked inside private family collections for a generation longer than it otherwise would have. There's a broader lesson buried in the Freeport phenomenon that ties directly back to old money's core financial habits, covered throughout this channel. For many serious collectors, art functions less like decoration and more like an extremely illiquid privately held asset class. Similar in spirit to the private equity and real estate positions discussed in our video on old money's investment philosophy, just wrapped in a canvas instead of a limited partnership agreement. The painting doesn't need to be displayed to hold its value. It simply needs to exist, be authenticated, and be quietly transferred, generation after generation, exactly the way a piece of farmland or a trust fund would be. This is exactly the kind of concrete, mechanism-first breakdown this channel exists for. If the Freeport system surprised you, drop a comment with the word vault. It tells me you want more deep dives into how real wealth is actually stored and transferred. 3. The watch designed to outlive its owner. There's a single advertising slogan that captures old money's entire relationship with fine watches more precisely than almost any academic description could. You never actually own a Patek Philippe. You merely look after it for the next generation. Patek Philippe, founded in 1839 and one of the very few major watchmakers to have remained independently owned since 1932, has built its entire brand identity around exactly this idea, that a fine mechanical watch isn't purchased to be consumed and discarded, but acquired specifically to be inherited. And the numbers behind why this positioning actually holds up financially are genuinely striking. Patek Philippe produces only an estimated 60,000 to 70,000 watches a year, a tiny fraction of the roughly 1 million watches per year produced by a mass premium competitor like Rolex, a scarcity that, combined with the brand's refusal to meaningfully expand production, even as global demand has surged, has turned specific references into some of the most reliably appreciating physical objects in the world. The most extreme documented example, when Patek Philippe discontinued its stainless steel Nautilus reference 5711 in 2021, a watch that retailed for approximately $35,000. Secondary market prices for existing examples spiked to somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 almost overnight. Broader analysis of the vintage Nautilus market found appreciation in the range of 200 to 300% for models purchased in the 1990s, with some individual references appreciating considerably more. Watch industry analysts specifically flag this pattern as different in kind from ordinary luxury goods. A well-preserved vintage Calatrava from the 1950s or 1960s frequently sells today for more, even adjusted for inflation, than its original purchase price, a genuine rarity in a category, luxury consumer goods, where almost everything else depreciates the moment it leaves the store. The deeper principle behind this, and the reason it belongs on this list alongside farmland and fine art, is the same principle running through nearly every asset in this video: deliberate, sustained scarcity, combined with genuine multi-generational utility. A fine watch doesn't need to be actively traded to hold its value the way a stock does. It can sit in a drawer for 30 years, be worn occasionally, serviced periodically, and handed down, still functioning exactly as intended, to a grandchild who was born decades after it was purchased. Watch industry commentary consistently frames this exact quality, being an enduring asset rather than a disposable luxury item, as central to why brands like Patek Philippe have deliberately marketed themselves toward multi-generational ownership rather than short-term resale. If the idea of a watch appreciating like a blue-chip stock is new to you, that's exactly why this channel exists, to make this world usable knowledge. Subscribe so the rest of this series doesn't get lost in your feed. 4. Wine, the asset that literally improves while you wait. Fine wine occupies a category all its own on this list, because it's the rare asset that doesn't just hold its value while sitting untouched. It can genuinely, physically improve, at least for a defined window, simply by being left alone. The mechanics of fine wine as an investment center almost entirely on a small handful of top-tier producers, overwhelmingly concentrated in Bordeaux and Burgundy, whose bottles are tracked by an index called LIVX, widely regarded as the closest thing the wine world has to a stock market ticker. Wealthy collectors frequently buy these wines while still en primeur, meaning while the wine is still aging in barrel, before it's even bottled, locking in a price years before the finished product ever reaches a shelf. Because top-tier vintages are produced in genuinely limited quantities, and because critical scores and drinking windows shift as a vintage matures, a well-chosen case of a top Bordeaux estate's best vintage can appreciate substantially over a decade or two of proper cellar storage, entirely independent of what's happening in equity markets during that same window. This asset class connects to the same underlying principle covered throughout this entire video, but with a uniquely literal twist. Unlike a stock certificate or a piece of farmland, a bottle of wine has a built-in, biologically determined reason to be held for decades rather than traded quickly. The wine inside it is, quite literally, still becoming a better version of itself. This is, in a strange way, the most direct physical embodiment of the patient capital philosophy covered in our earlier video on old money's investment rules, an asset that structurally punishes short-term thinking and rewards decades of undisturbed patience, because the alternative to waiting isn't just a worse return. It's a bottle that was opened before it was ready. Proper storage itself becomes part of the investment, which is precisely why serious collectors frequently pay for professional, climate-controlled cellar space rather than storing valuable bottles at home. A detail that mirrors the same instinct behind art Freeports covered earlier in this video. The asset's value depends heavily on provenance and verified undisturbed condition, and professional third-party storage protects both. 5. Water, the asset nobody talked about until recently. There's a final, newer category on old money's shopping list that deserves attention, specifically because it's the one most people have never heard discussed as an asset class at all. Water rights. In much of the western United States and other arid regions around the world, water isn't a feature that automatically comes bundled with land ownership. It's a legally separate, tradable right, governed by its own complex body of law, and it can be bought, sold, and leased independently of the land it irrigates. As freshwater scarcity has become an increasingly pressing global concern, driven by population growth, climate variability, and agricultural demand, sophisticated investors, including wealthy family offices already deeply invested in farmland, as covered earlier in this video, have increasingly begun treating water rights themselves as a distinct, appreciating asset, separate from the land they're historically attached to. The logic connecting this back to everything else in this video should by now feel familiar. Water rights share the exact same core characteristic that makes farmland, fine art, and rare watches so appealing to patient capital, a fixed, non-manufacturable supply facing rising, structurally guaranteed long-term demand. Nobody can create more fresh water the way a company can issue more shares. As agricultural, municipal, and industrial demand for reliable water access continues to climb in water-stressed regions, the legal right to a defined, reliable allocation of that water has begun to command real, and in some cases, rapidly appreciating market value entirely on its own. It's worth being appropriately cautious here, because this is a genuinely newer and more regionally specific market than the other assets covered in this video, with far less long-term historical data and far more variation by jurisdiction. But the underlying instinct old money is applying to it is identical to everything else on this list. Identify a resource that is structurally scarce, cannot be manufactured on demand, and will almost certainly matter more, not less, to whoever holds the rights to it 50 or 100 years from now. This is the part of old money investing that rarely gets explained clearly. The newer, quieter asset categories being added to the same centuries-old shopping list. If you want the mechanism first version of this world every week, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. 6. The one thing every asset on this list has in common. Step back from the individual details of farmland, art, watches, wine, and water, and a single, consistent pattern emerges across every single asset covered in this video. One that connects directly to nearly everything else this channel has covered about how old money actually thinks. Every asset on this list shares 3 specific characteristics. First, genuine, structural scarcity. None of these things can simply be manufactured in greater quantity the moment demand rises, unlike a company that can issue new shares or a currency a government can print more of. Second, multi-generational utility that doesn't depend on active trading. A piece of farmland, a painting, a watch, and a bottle of wine can all sit essentially untouched for decades, quietly holding or gaining value without requiring the kind of constant attention and transaction activity that a typical stock portfolio demands. And third, a built-in resistance to the hedonic treadmill covered in an earlier video on this channel. Because these assets are acquired for patient, long-term holding rather than short-term excitement, they don't generate the same psychologically corrosive cycle of escalating spending that destroys so many sudden fortunes. This is precisely why the list barely changes across centuries, even as the specific brands and categories evolve at the margins. Farmland has anchored old money portfolios since before recorded history. Fine art collecting, in its modern form, stretches back centuries to the earliest Renaissance patrons. Fine watches are a comparatively recent addition, dating only to the 19th century, and water rights as a formally traded asset class are newer still. But each new addition to the list has been selected using the exact same underlying criteria the oldest entries were chosen for. Old money doesn't chase whatever asset class is currently generating the most exciting headlines. It asks a much older, much simpler question. Will this still be scarce? And will this still matter 100 years from now? The actual lesson. Here's what ties every asset in this video together. None of them were chosen because they were exciting, trendy, or likely to double in value within a single fiscal quarter. They were chosen because a family confident enough to think in decades, not days, recognized that scarcity and patience compound in exactly the same way money does, quietly, invisibly, for years, until the gap between a family that bought land, art, and fine craftsmanship a century ago and one that didn't becomes impossible to ignore. Bill Gates isn't buying farmland because he needs the quarterly cash flow. Serious collectors aren't storing paintings in a Geneva vault because they enjoy the storage fees. They're doing exactly what old money families have done with land, craftsmanship, and rare, unrepeatable resources for centuries, identifying the small handful of things the world can never simply manufacture more of, and quietly, patiently, making sure their family owns a piece of it. Old money doesn't just protect its capital through trusts, its heirs through education, and its portfolio through diversification. It protects all of it at the most fundamental level by buying the handful of things that were scarce 1,000 years ago, remain scarce today, and, by their very nature, will almost certainly still be scarce long after everyone watching this video is gone. If this changed how you think about what real lasting wealth is actually made of, subscribe to Old Money Opulence. New investigations into the real mechanics behind generational wealth drop every week. And if you want to see how these same assets get structured to pass tax efficiently between generations, watch the companion video. How Old Money Legally Pays Less Tax breaks down exactly how families move assets like these from one generation to the next. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.